Hello and a very warm welcome to this roundtable with me, David Foster. Just how bad have China-US relations got? So bad it appears that there have been reports that Chinese officials have been warned not just to expect a Cold War, but to be prepared for actual hostilities. Beijing and Washington facing off. How did it get to this? And are there ways to dial it all down before it's too late?
Relations between Beijing and Washington have been increasingly hostile in recent years. But as the coronavirus continues to claim thousands of lives and wreak havoc on economies, the animosity has moved to new levels. In recent weeks, the Trump administration has threatened to increase tariffs and scrap a multi-billion-dollar trade deal with China, and is now contemplating ways to punish China for what it sees as withholding information about the virus.
There are many things we could do. We could do things, we could cut off the whole relationship.
But such a step would likely inflict drastic damage onto the US economy, which heavily relies on significant trade with China. In 2018, two-way trade between the two superpowers amounted to $659.8 billion. Chinese officials dismissed Trump's remarks as a farce and likened the idea of reparations to blackmail, with Chinese media going so far as threatening to engulf America in the mighty sea of coronavirus by blocking exports of vital medical equipment. Some fear that a new Cold War could be emerging, causing a long-lasting rift between East and West. Could such combative rhetoric between the two superpowers undermine the global capacity to get through the current crisis? And how will this affect the rest of the world?
Okay, time to get talking and listening. In a little while, we'll hear from Sir Simon Fraser, formerly at the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, now a Foreign Affairs Advisor, and Humphrey Hawksley, writer and commentator on world affairs with special expertise on China. But first, let's say hello in Washington, D.C. to Clete Willems, former top White House trade negotiator and partner at the law firm Aiken Gump. And in Hong Kong, we have Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, political science professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University. Great to have you on the program. Clete, let me come to you first of all. When you have an internal Chinese document allegedly saying we must prepare for confrontation, was that what you were thinking of when you said recently, if we're not careful, things will get a great deal worse?
I think the Chinese document speaks for itself. And if you have the Chinese government saying that it is worried about this eventuality, I think all of us need to be realistic that if we do not figure out a way to cooperate with each other, if we do not figure out a way to change the trajectory that we're on, that is a possible eventuality. Now, I very much would like to avoid that. I think it would be devastating for us to go into a Cold War or to something worse. But right now, I think tensions are growing considerably in the United States and in China. I think it's important to realize that this is not simply an American phenomena. It's something that's happening over there as well, and that their government is using increasingly hostile rhetoric towards the United States, and that puts us into a very combustible situation.
Yeah, and then in a little while, we'll talk about what could possibly be done to dial it down, to de-escalate the situation. Jean-Pierre, let me come to you in Hong Kong. You also said recently that war is one of the options. Is that likely, in your opinion, in this case, some kind of conflict?
I think there is still a long distance between Cold War and a war. What we are witnessing today, it's emerging Cold War between the United States and China, and mainly caused by China and the rhetoric Clete was alluding to, because China has been more and more anti-Western, both for domestic reasons, but because of it wants to compete with the United States for the world leadership. And it's very much a game between the rising power and established power. And China is taking more risks to achieve that objective of toppling the United States as the main superpower on the planet. Now, at the same time, I think we need to draw a line between possible incidents which can occur or may occur in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, and elsewhere, where the U.S. and the Chinese Navy may, encounter each other, and an all-out war, which is, in my view, very unlikely between two nuclear powers. And I have, of course, in mind the old Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, where both powers had similar nuclear panoplies and a number of warheads, but were unable to, of course, go to war, direct war between each other.
There is something that you've referred to in the past called the Thucydides trap, when one great power tries to displace another, some kind of conflict is going to happen. Therefore, one has to ask, is that exactly what is being planned here, for China to displace America and perhaps then to fall into this trap?
I think China is hoping to be able to displace the United States peacefully without going to war. Now, the Thucydides trap theory has been developed by a number of people, including Graham Allison. I tend to disagree with it because there is no. I think the cases of war between the rising power and established power were cases which took place before the nuclear era. And now, since 1945, we are in the nuclear era, where it's getting much more. The threshold of going to war between two nuclear powers and the stake are much higher than in the past. So I think, again, an open war between China and the US remains today unlikely because of the various costs at stake.
Let me quote this, and then I'll come to you, Clete. This is from the Quincy Institute, Responsible Statecraft, which advocates restraint in US military policy. Rachael Odell here. And this is what she says. This is such a dangerous dynamic for the world. Both governments are trying to profit domestically off the other's failures, fighting fire with fire as the world burns. As a former trade negotiator, I wonder whether you've thought about whether this is to do with simple security or it's about economic and trade dominance.
I think for the United States, it's really about both. And my role in it was more on the economic side and in trying to create a level playing field in China, trying to push back on the massive level of subsidies that they have in place, trying to put back on the discriminatory policies that tried to build Chinese national or global champions at the expense of American and European and other companies. And so that was where the primary focus was. But for me, but I do see these two issues coming together. And what you have in the United States is you have this growing coalition of individuals, primarily on the left, who had been for a long time focused on the economic challenge posed by China, and folks on the right who have been increasingly concerned about the national security threat posed by China. They are now coming together. And that has created a very strong bipartisan viewpoint in the United States that we need to push back on China, and part of what's created this dynamic that I was talking about earlier. Now, if I may, I want to comment quickly on this idea of the Thucydides trap and how do we get out of it. I've spent some time talking with Graham Allison up at Harvard about it. And the one conclusion that I come to, and I really think it is the only answer, is that the U.S. and other countries that are also concerned about some of China's ambitions on the national security and economic front need to work together. Because if China views this as the U.S. trying to keep it down for its own, reasons, I think China has one reaction, and I think it's a very negative one. But if, on the other hand, the global community is all saying to China, your policies of discrimination, your policy of putting back doors into our equipment is unacceptable, then there's a different reaction, because then they are seen as out of step with global norms. And so I think it's really important that we find a way to work together with others so that China does not view this as a one-on-one US-China dynamic, but rather China views it as something where the global community is telling them that some of their worst practices need to change.
Okay, Jean-Pierre, we'll talk about rowing back from this if it is at all possible. But first, I want to quote some words used by the Chinese propaganda machine, I suppose you would have to call it, what are known these days as China's wolves. They go out with a form of megaphone diplomacy, not gunboat diplomacy, saying what the America's doing is propaganda warfare, filthy behavior, Pompeo's lost his moral compass, spitting poison, evil, speaking nonsense. How do you dial all that down?
Well, China is has decided the best defense is to go on the offensive. I think China is facing a dilemma here. On the one hand, it wants to have a stable relationship with the West, with the developed countries, with democracies. But at the same time, it wants to take advantage of them, of the openness of their societies, of the economies, to acquire as much technology as possible, and also to defend the one-party system, which it was put into place 70 years ago, and to also fight against Western democracy around the world. So the problem is for China is the danger of, on the economic side, having more economies deciding, if not to decouple with the Chinese economy, at least to move away from China, to reduce their dependency upon the Chinese economy. And that's what the COVID-19 crisis has sort of highlighted, is that there's a need to become less dependent on China for a number of strategic projects.
Yeah, so China's position, in a sense, might be weakened by a retreat from globalization. Will China's position be helped, do you think, Clete, if your former boss doesn't make it back to the White House in November and Joe Biden takes his place, or will he have to use Chinese, anti-Chinese rhetoric to almost win the election because there's so much anti-China sentiment?
Right. I think an important point for everyone to realize is this is not just a President Trump thing. And I think President Trump personally has shown leadership in dealing with this issue. But this is something, as I mentioned, has been long festering on the Democratic side. And in a lot of ways, President Trump stole a key Democratic issue from them. And, Vice President Biden's campaign has believed that this is a bit of a weakness for their candidate. And so I think that they are going to try to compensate for that by trying to out-Trump Trump on China. And so I think you see both sides moving in an increasingly adversarial direction with respect to China. I don't think the election will change things dramatically. It may change some of the tactics. It may change some of the rhetoric, but I don't think it's going to change the policy trajectory in a significant way.
Listen, thank you both very much indeed. That's Clete Willems talking to us from the United States, and Jean-Pierre Cabestan from Hong Kong. We appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much. Now, taking a seat at the round table, we have Sir Simon Fraser, once the top civil servant at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, now managing partner of consultancy firm Flint Global. And we welcome back Humphrey Hawksley, former foreign correspondent at the BBC, author and commentator on world affairs. His latest book, Asian Waters, actually going to hold it up here, The Struggle Over the Asia Pacific and the Strategy of Chinese Expansion. Humphrey, there's going to be a reprint next month, 2 years after the first edition came out. How much has changed in US-China relations in that time?
The reason that it's being expanded and redone is because the essential paradigm's changed. So when I was writing that 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot of talk about, is this like the First World War and a jostling for new rising powers and the rest of it? And now there's the talk about the new Cold War, which I don't think is helpful for the conversation. This is more like that China is being positioned as a bad, immoral, evil power. And it's a sudden change. So if we think about the golden era that Britain announced with China a few years back, that this was going to be a great partnership going on for all millennia, and now we've got a country that is the problems with Hong Kong, the million Muslim Uyghurs in camps, forced camps in Xinjiang, the occupation or the building of military bases on the South China Sea. And what's happened in the past two or 3 years here, David, is that the West, particularly Europe and the US, has sort of drawn a line. And they've said, enough is enough. We are now going to push back against this because you have essentially different values to our values. The European Union called China a systemic rival that was advocating alternative forms of governance. This is quite a serious element. So 3 or 4 years ago, there was this idea that China was a developing country, and once its economy was in place, it would become a democracy just like all of us. So that sort of post-fall of communism type of utopia that we all talked about then. That is now not in the argument, particularly from the US. This is a non-democratic one-party state, and it is a threat to us, and therefore we have to find a way of dealing with it.
So, Simon, do you see that as the reality, or is it simply a narrative that's being pushed out by those who stand to profit, perhaps, from China being pushed into the naughty corner and taken away from the centre of the world stage?
Well, I broadly agree with the analysis, but this is something which has been going on for some time because, of course, at the beginning, a few years ago, we welcomed the growth of China. It was an essential part of the globalization story. It was an essential part of the making poverty history story, which was a great Western narrative. But over time, that has changed, and that we've become more worried about the consequences of Chinese political and economic growth. And frankly, we miscalculated it. We didn't really think through what it would mean. And now, particularly with COVID, we're getting this sort of exacerbation of a sense of antagonism, particularly between America and China, which, of course, Donald Trump has been fueling as well. So that is the case. But the behaviors have changed on both sides. American posture has hardened, and Chinese behavior has changed as well. So there's no question that one side is right and the other is wrong. Both sides are now positioning themselves for a pretty antagonistic and difficult relationship, and that's going to affect the whole world.
On the website foreignpolicy.com, we had these words: the contests for economic advantage, military dominance, technological prowess, and ideology will be part of geopolitics for years to come. The pandemic has only made this more clear. So on the one side, we have China. On the other side, in terms of their size, we have the United States. What about those countries that need to work with both China and the United States? The UK, for example, after leaving the European Union, what does it need to do?
Yeah, well, of course, this sort of geopolitical standoff is putting pressure, immense pressure on the whole international system now and on international organizations. And it's also putting great pressure. By the way, we've just seen that most dramatically, the WHO, but it's also putting pressure on other countries, as you say. So the European Union, the Europeans generally, including the UK, have to work out how we position ourselves. We want, of course, a very close relationship with the United States. It's a great democratic ally. But I think we also want to have a constructive economic and political relationship with China. And if the relationship between China and the US gets worse, then the risk is we get squeezed in the middle and we get confronted with a sort of binary choice between these two great powers. And that is really not where we want to be. We want to find a way to tether them in an international system of norms, which allows us to have some purchase on their behaviors.
Humphrey, not since 1989, many commentators are suggesting, has China's position in the world been viewed so antagonistically, not since the massacre in Tiananmen Square. Has China done this without thought, or is it something that is just a consequence of its own inward-looking ways, or what sort of mistake has it made?
I think that what we're seeing now, particularly with the COVID element that was just mentioned, is China feeling that it's backed into a corner and lashing out. I think that up until Xi Jinping came to power, there was this steady trajectory whereby you could get a merging going on there. But even in the past, couple of weeks or so, what we've seen as the attacks on China have gone up has been just in the past day. I think there's a tension, increased tension on the India-China border. China has been picking fights again in the South China Sea with Vietnam and with Japan. Now, what you've got to think is, if you are not quite yet ready to take over, the lead superpower of the world, why pick those fights at a time like this? And then when you pull back on that, you see that China doesn't have allies like the United States. China is alone. It might be big, but it doesn't have the sort of networks of alliances that the US has built up over many, many years. So what is happening now is that you've got a lot of the Western countries saying, right, now we've got to stop having Chinese products inside our critical infrastructure. You've got France and Britain deploying back into Asia and joining with the US to balance China's power. So you've also got a sort of cultish figure there, nearing at the dictatorship type of figure, who probably isn't getting the sort of advice that other Chinese leaders were getting when it was a less tight regime. So in my view, and I may well be wrong, I think that China is actually setting itself up for a fall, because
I've got to move. I just want to bring this one, wrap this one up a little bit, Humphrey, if I may. So, Simon, let me put it this way. Humphrey mentioned China feeling cornered. Is it going to feel even more cornered now that the COVID crisis is here and we're seeing a retreat from globalization, when in fact so much of its wealth over the last 15, 20 years has come from its ability to be able to reach out to the wider world? Is it going to be more frightened cornered tiger, perhaps?
I don't think it's going to be cornered necessarily for that reason, but I do think there's a lot of pressure within China now on the leadership and on the party. And of course, if they can't deliver sustained economic growth, which is not happening at the moment, then that is a big problem for them. So in the short term, I think there's a lot of reason for them to be pretty aggressive towards America, and vice versa. America and Donald Trump trying to shift the blame for his handling of the crisis is going to blame China. So in the short term, on both sides, I think you'll see antagonism. But the big question is, in the long term, will they recognize that they both have an interest in a stable political global economic system in which they are interdependent? That's why, as Humphrey says, it's not like the Cold War. They are very interdependent. And in the longer term, there should be pressures which lead them to seek coexistence. Whether that will happen or not remains to be seen, but that must be the optimistic version. And if we have a change of president in Washington later this year, I think there's a better chance of that taking place.
Well, this was where I was going next, because some commentators have suggested that Joe Biden will be just as anti-Chinese as Donald Trump in the run-up to the election, because he recognizes that goes down well with the voters in the United States. But Humphrey, do you think come January next year, let's say it's President Biden moving into the Oval Office, do you think he will be much more in favor of rapprochement than Donald Trump is?
I think he'll be much more balanced. He will find ways of trying to get the common ground and get the common interests and build up, even though the values are different and one's a one-party state, one's a democracy. He'll dampen that rhetoric a lot. But it also will require a change of mindset on China's side as well, because it's become very rich by selling to North America, by selling to Europe, and it's actually by doing what it's been doing over the past few years, it has gone too far. So there will be limits to how much of Chinese, this golden era that Britain announced, how much we will allow that into our economies. I think a Biden presidency would be more tranquil on that front, but it won't solve the deep problems, and that is that how politicians in the West need to describe to the electorate what sort of nation China is. What are their values, and where do we have common ground, and where do we have grounds that we have to separate off our common interests?
Simon, final word. If it's gone too far, as Humphrey suggests, has it gone too far, too late?
Well, I don't think it's too late, but I absolutely agree with Humphrey that it depends on China just as much as it depends on America. And there is no monopoly of virtue here. And clearly there are risks involved for us from China, which we have to be alive to. There are security problems that we all are aware of. But in the end, We all live on the same planet. These are the two great sort of wrestlers, taking each other on here, and the rest of us are watching. And we all have an interest in avoiding this becoming a complete bare-knuckle fistfight between the two of them, and in keeping it within some sort of set of rules which enable us all to prosper. That's the objective. Whether it can be achieved is still an open question.
Thank you both very, very much indeed. Sir Simon Fraser talking to us from London, as was Humphrey Hawksley, author of Asian Waters, former BBC correspondent. Appreciate your expertise, both of you, on this subject. And thank you very much for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team. We hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.